I was thinking about that song, Despacito. You know that song that like dominated airplay across the world for 6 months and got like 5 billion views on YouTube? I think it should be recut for the NHL season, Esposito. Kind of as a homage to Phil Esposito, one of the greatest players on the Boston Bruins. He had a brother, Tony, played goalie, I believe, for the Chicago Blackhawks. Esposito, he scored many goals a Gecko. His brother, Tony, is on Chicago. You know what I'm saying? Like, it'd be a fun song for the fans in the NHL.
I think pretty much you're the only fan of the NHL who watches this podcast anyway.
I doubt that seriously, but nevertheless, what's happening?
Well, I did notice in El Salvador we had 400 days without any homicides since President Bukele took over. And what I want to say is, like, when you look over in the United States, just July 4th of July, there was just like mass death in every city. DC, New York, Chicago, all of the cities. They had all these sort of homicides and deaths and shootings in New York City and blah, blah, blah. So, to me, it's interesting because I think this is really important part of the Enlightenment ideals of life, liberty, and property, and pursuit of happiness. Like, to protect life is the most important for any government. And so here on Independence Day in America, they're not independent at all because they don't have even the basic human right of their right to life.
Gosh darn it, you're absolutely correct. They have a basic function: protect people's life, liberty, and property. And over there in the United States, it's not happening. Over the weekend, massive brawls and gunfights and shootings and killings all over east to west. There's like a arbitrage between the U.S. and El Salvador. It's like a death arbitrage, or you could call it a death-trage. Between these two countries. Go long El Salvador, go short United States of America, and do the death-trage trade for 2023 and beyond.
Well, it's definitely, one guy we used to interview all the time was Steve Keen on the Kaiser Report. And in fact, I think he was on episode number 2 or 3. Anyway, so one of the things he always talked about with debt, remember his whole thing was debt and the Minsky moment, is there's a sort of Minsky moment situation here. Is he always talked about the most important thing wasn't the absolute the quantity of debt, but it was the velocity of how fast it was increasing. And the same thing that you could see in the psychology happening between the two countries is the velocity of how much faster things are getting better or worse. So there's definitely a sense of things getting rapidly worse in the United States. Right? We see that all the time. It started out as, in the days that the FBI did run Twitter, they used to shut down, the neo-Nazis, they would call them, or white supremacists who did mention the mass looting happening in San Francisco, for example. Now that Elon Musk has taken over, okay, there's a little bit more freedom on there, but also everybody has to, even the social justice warriors recognize that Nordstrom, Hilton, all these massive chains are fleeing San Francisco, so they have to admit it's real. But the vibe on the street is real. Like, people see that things are getting worse. People see all that homelessness and looting and the plunder going unpunished. Here it's the opposite, right? So the things are getting better so fast that, this is why we have the boom times here.
Steve Keen talks about the velocity of debt, and what we're talking about is the velocity of death. The death velocity is increasing in these states, in these counties, in these municipalities that are encumbered by the kakistocracy. These are the politicians who are the worst of the worst, and they are not able to give the people the life, liberty, and the property protection that they get and enjoy here in El Salvador, where the death rate is plummeting and the people are dancing in the street. Just this past few days, they had the Central American Games. It's like the Olympics, but for Central America. And they have people running and swimming and jumping and doing all kinds of sporty things. And the stadium they built in 18 months, that's packed every day, 35,000 participants. It's named after some famous footballer here named Magico. Who's got a restaurant just down the street, Mexico restaurant. And he was there, and he's walking up the stairs, and he's saying hello to people, and they're all dancing. They're literally dancing in the aisles. They're literally dancing in the aisles that have been liberated like VE Day in 1945, and they are happy as fuck.
Well, I believe it's the velocity of good times rather than velocity of death, because that's focusing on the bad side of the story. And the velocity of good times is increasing very fast here, and it's slowing down rapidly in the United States. So the good times are over in the United States. No amount of hot dogs and fireworks could disguise it, and that's why people are coming here. But
okay, you could call velocity of life, I like the
velocity of good times.
Good times, like the onomatopoeia, velocity of death versus velocity of debt. That's the poet in me. I look for these types of things, alliterations, onomatopoeia, the pita bread, maybe with a schmear. That's the kind of things I look for. Velocity of good times, that works too. It's the flip side. For every buyer, there's a seller. For every night, there's a dawn. For every rabbit, there's a sparrow.
I don't know what you're talking about. Hey, by the way, I think this is like Chekhov's gun here, this hat here. So we actually have a film crew recording us right now from Hollywood. They're actually Hollywood movie directors.
Yeah.
No.
Feature
so
film.
I was saying, if you put the hat somewhere in the scene, just like, Chekhov said, if you put a gun in the scene in the first act.
Is that hat going to go off?
It might go on.
Go on. Okay.
It has to go on.
It goes on and gets off.
You've got that hat squisher, and I don't like my hat squished.
It's the hat shaper.
I
know you don't like it, but listen, when it comes to the bill on a hat, you got to have the hat shaper, okay? Sergio, the hat man, he sent me the hat shaper in the last shipment of hats, and you put the bill of the hat into the hat shaper, and you get that nice shape of the hat. Now, you like your hat, it's like a duck bill. There's no shape to it, but, that's aesthetically not going to work in a country like this that values proper hat shapes and hat bill shapes. So I put your hat bill in the hat shaper. It came out shaping nicely. If you want to de-shape the hat, you get the hat de-shaper, okay? It's the reverse of the shaper. It just goes in backwards, and it realigns the hat, and it de-shapes it. Get Sergio to send you the hat de-shaper, and the problem is fixed.
So speaking of the problem being fixed, we have an education project here called CUBO Plus, and we're on the 4th day as we're recording this, the 5th day as it broadcasts. And so we have our 21 students who are getting the advanced education. It's really fun to be hanging out with all these Bitcoiners traveling around the world, from Italy, from Switzerland, from Canada, from the United States, to come here and educate. I call it Bitcoiners building the next generation of Bitcoiners. So they're helping train up the next generation of Bitcoin and Lightning devs. And these kids are going to graduate with a lot of knowledge, and they're going to be right up there with the best and brightest of the global class of Bitcoin engineers, and be able to command the same sort of income levels as those who live in any part of the world. Everything's work from home right now, right? So there should be Bitcoin should close that notion of there being a developed world income and a developing world income. You're either good or you're not. Just because the guy lives in San Salvador and not Austin, why would he be paid less?
Yeah, the global market for Bitcoin Lightning developers is well established, and it's a very high number for somebody who has those skills. So here in El Salvador, CUBO Plus is the program. You can follow it on Twitter at CUBO Plus, and right now it's in the elite phase, the final 2 weeks as I understand it, and we've got over 20 students. And so they are making this quantum leap.
Why do you say over 20 students? This is Bitcoin. You should mention that it's 21 students. That's like saying there's over 20 million Bitcoin.
Well, I'll tell you why.
Why?
Because the actual number of Bitcoin is slightly less than 21 billion. Okay,
Jesus.
and in this case, due to complications via travel and other restrictions, the total number of students, whether it's 21 or slightly under 21, is debatable. So I brought a level of precision that I felt this conversation warranted, seeing how we're talking about technology
Okay, so we
and
have
the granularity of a protocol that is changing the face of the earth. And these lucky students and talented, hardworking cadre of professionals are going to be making the big bucks. Now, I had lunch with them, and I sat down with them, and I said, when Lambo? And they
Oh my
looked at me
God,
like,
are you like-
you boomer scumbag. We are not into Lambos. We live proper Bitcoin lives. We sold our chairs. We sold our homes. We sold our cars to buy Bitcoin because we're Bitcoiners. And I felt ashamed that I had introduced Lamborghini into the conversation. I scurried out of that room with my tail between my legs, and I was being mocked as I was exiting the hotel door. That's what happened just 2 hours ago.
Right. Well, anyway, so it's been a fun adventure. It's been 1 year because it actually started 1 year ago, almost exactly, when Jimmy Song first arrived on July 17, 2022. Picked him up at the airport, and that was the beginning of the Jimmy Song 7. Our guy Mario is one of them, and Mario is now the lead for the Bitcoin office on the CUBO Plus project. So that's really cool. We have another week and a half because Jimmy Song is also coming. So CUBO Plus, technically the intense part, they graduate on July 15th, and there's a party out in El Zonte for anybody who wants to come. Then they graduate, and then the next day they start the Jimmy Song course. Like there's no proof of stake in this country. It's just proof of work. Like, okay, congratulations, you graduate, now go to work. Like you have to go, start working on Jimmy Song's course, and then they're going to go to Tuscany, Italy, for a 10-day program of intense workshops with, again, big names in Lightning. It's a Lightning workshop. And then they'll go to the Lugano Plan B forum. So it's a pretty exciting course, I think.
Oh, yeah, it's unquestionably exciting. I mean, the students, I talked to them, and they are thrilled. They're just thrilled to bits. And it's a great opportunity for them. But I think next year, once the word gets out of how successful it's been and the opportunities that are being offered these students, the groundswell of interest is going to be enormous. So we look forward to that.
Yeah, thank you, Folger Ventures, of course, because they're the ones that are totally financing it all, and they're out of Lugano, Switzerland, so that's a huge win for our Bitcoin embassy there. Remember, we're the first country in the world to have a Bitcoin embassy. Yeah, so any topics you're interested in, Max?
Oh, well, I've been following Volcano Energy quite closely. This is a new billion-dollar startup here in El Salvador. And it's mining Bitcoin using wind and solar and geothermal. And the thread that I follow on Twitter at Volcano Energy has always got interesting tidbits of news and information and history about Bitcoin mining and the geopolitical diversity of Bitcoin mining. And this particular tweet from today talks about Iceland. They lead the way in renewable energy. Since 1982, over 99% of their electricity production comes from clean sources, with hydroelectric and geothermal power taking the lead. Hydro makes up 75%, while geothermal contributes approximately 25%. Now, the reason why this is all very interesting to me is because, back in the old days when we were making little documentary films, we went to Iceland and we made a film about why their banking system was going to collapse. And sure enough, it did collapse. And it was called Money Geyser, I believe. And we talked to a lot of folks in the geothermal mining industry. And the geothermal mining industry, of course, in Iceland is one where they're able to export energy by using that almost free source of energy to smelt aluminum. So they ship the aluminum ingots away from the country. It's like shipping the energy that they get from the magma of the volcano. Now, here in El Salvador, as we discussed geothermal mining over the years, Iceland has always been uppermost in my mind as a comparative study as to what could be possible here. And so when I see Iceland in the Volcano Energy Twitter feed, it just brings back so many happy memories of visiting Iceland and making a little documentary film. Putting me out in the car, it was 30 below zero, and I only had like a little jacket on and a suit. And you're like, no, do another take. And my lips are blue and I'm frozen, and you're in the car with your furry hat and your furry gloves. You're like, do another take. And I'm literally can't move. I'm frozen like this. I can't do that at all. But we got through it. The film was a classic. It's available somewhere in cyberspace. I don't know where, but you should find it and review it because it really touches the nerve of geothermal mining in the Northern Hemisphere. I recommend it highly.
Actually, we didn't talk about geothermal at all, other than that there was a volcano that had erupted.
Minor detail.
But actually, it's interesting because it ties back to Bitcoin and everything that we did after that. Because we were that was in 2007 that we had traveled to Iceland. Of course, the financial crisis began in 2008 and 2009, and it was in October of 2008 that Satoshi published the white paper, and it was in 2009 when we mined the first Bitcoin in January 3rd. So it was leading up to that, and Iceland certainly was at the forefront of the beginning of the end for the fiat world, because they were really at the forefront. How that whole show came about is interesting, right? Because our British executive at Al Jazeera English asked us to make a program. He didn't know how it was happening, but how was it that Iceland was buying up all of the major retailers on the high street in London, especially the prestige ones all along Regent Street and Oxford Street. So that's all he asked, is like, how are they able to do this? And so
That was the remit.
That was the remit, and we went to Iceland. Well, we did some research from London, and it was quite easy to figure out very fast.
Yes.
And it was the carry trade and a huge amount of leverage.
Huge banking scandal.
Huge amount of leverage amongst the same thing that happened in Ireland, a small group of banker guys who were lending to each other, increasing the value of their asset base and the alleged value of their bank, kind of like how shitcoins operate, right? They have their own token on an exchange, and they trade 5% of it, and they increase the value, and then they borrow against it. Sam Bankman-Fried did the same exact thing. So that's a bookend to what we saw in 2007.
That's what I was getting at.
But they were buying up real assets, and this is exactly what we see here in the world of crypto. So you have 25,000 cryptos. Just what they were doing in Iceland and what they were doing in Ireland is leveraging up a lot of dollars, euros, krona, whatever currency they had, and they were buying real assets with it. The same thing happens with exchange tokens and these other tokens. That Sam Bankman-Fried, being the spokesperson for this, the symbol of it all, he had this token FTT, and he used that, like traded a little bit on his exchange and made the value allegedly on paper worth $40 billion, and then borrowed real dollars against that, and then bought real assets of houses and Bitcoin. Right,
Iceland was the prototype, the blueprint for Sam Bankman-Fried's FTX, FTT scandal of 2022, 2023. It was all there in Iceland, in the Icelandic banking sector. Now, the thing about Iceland is that once the whole thing started to unravel, bankers were prosecuted, and they, I'm not mistaken, actually faced some jail time, right?
And, Iceland's like got a jail with like 2 beds in it. It's not exactly like hard time there.
No, they get hot and cold running baklava and all the blankets.
Herring and some.
Herring, they get all the herring sushi they want. But they went after the bankers. They also allowed the Icelandic krona to collapse, as I recall now. And they were rebuilding from scratch, essentially. They rebuilt the entire economy from scratch. And they were the better for it. And the people that did the bad things got punished, and the country was recapitalized. But it is a great little film that portends the shitcoin fandango that has blighted.
It's
years.
basically the same thing. Like the whole fiat world scam is based off of gold. It's built on top of gold, and it's a way to steal your real assets, your gold, your property, and things like that. And the same thing naturally happened when we had perfect money of Bitcoin. All these shitcoins developed in order to steal your Bitcoin and therefore your ultimate property. So we have people like Larry Fink was in the news, because it's funny. I remember doing a episode of one of our podcasts a few years ago where I did some audio manipulation, audio edit on my voice, pretending that Larry Fink was high and like buying Bitcoin or something like that. He was talking about Bitcoin in my dramatization of him.
Yeah, he said it monetizes bank fraud or monetizes money laundering, or he said at that time in the beginning, Larry Fink was that Bitcoin is fraud, digital fraud. He was very disparaging.
So just so you know out there, in case you don't, is Larry Fink is, he's the head of BlackRock.
Yes.
So that's the biggest financial institution in the world.
$9 trillion. I mean, when we talked about him originally, he was the BlackRock only had $1 trillion.
Yeah.
Now it's got $9 trillion.
Yeah. Well, that's how that fiat scam works. But they're obviously getting into Bitcoin. They're seeking a Bitcoin ETF.
Yes.
Because of course they want to swap the paper. They want to give you paper for your Bitcoin. Of course.
Well, he said it's an international asset and it's digital gold. So he's saying the exact same things as hardcore Bitcoiners like myself and others, and you and Michael Saylor and others have been saying now for 12, 13 years, that it's digital gold, that it's an asset class. And if you're in the money management business, you need to take any asset class seriously, and you need to look at it in terms of asset allocation, and should I allocate percentage of my portfolio to this asset? And from there, you open up a world of $100 trillion worth of discretionary funds being managed by money managers around the world. And if only 5% of that money ends up in Bitcoin, you're talking about a price is $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 of Bitcoin, which of course is a target that's now within reach. If Larry Fink over BlackRock, the $9 trillion gun, is going to start firing bullets at the little Bitcoin target.
Well, it doesn't even matter what the price is, right? Because there's only more than 20 million Bitcoin.
There's more than 20 million Bitcoin. Okay? They can take it from me. 2.5 later.
But the other interesting thing that I want to point out before I forget this, because I didn't sleep actually last night, so I keep on forgetting what I'm trying to say. And what I'm trying to say is this. Oh, I forgot. No, what I'm trying to say is this, is that apparently Larry Fink, and it might have been in this interview, and it might have been in something else, but there's so much social media, and there's Twitter, there's Threads now that looks exactly like Twitter.
Exactly.
And it looks so much like Twitter that even Mark Zuckerberg finally tweeted for the first time in 12 years of the Spider-Man pointing at it, like, we're the same thing, right? Okay, well, that's kind of weird, because you're admitting that you're just a ripoff of the other thing. That he's like, that's it. That's how shitcoins market themselves. It's like, we're not actually Bitcoin, but we're pretending to look like it. Anyway, so the point is this. And somebody apparently, and it might have been that interview that Larry Fink said it's the universal assets, whatever, the international asset. He said crypto. He started talking about crypto and blockchain. And the CNBC journalist, apparently, if the person wasn't feeding me misinformation in my Twitter feed, is that apparently the CNBC journalist said, nobody I know uses blockchain, but so many people I know use Bitcoin.
Yeah, it's incredible. CNBC is educated. The anchor that said this was one of their prime anchors. The name escapes me at the moment, but he's been open to Bitcoin now for, I'd say, 5 or 6 years. And they also have that guy, Tom, somebody on CNBC, who's been very pro-Bitcoin for 5 or 6 years. But I was going to say that if Abe Lincoln, the 16th
that guy?
president of the United States, if he were talking about Bitcoin, he would say 1 score and 1 Bitcoin ago.
Okay.
You see what I'm saying?
No.
Fourscore, his famous speech.
I know that, yeah, but why would...
20 years. 20 years. So one score in one Bitcoin is 21. So I'm making an Abe Lincoln joke.
Oh, that's funny.
Isn't that cute?
Yeah. Cute.
For President's Day.
That was a few months ago, but I do want to say also, the two Jacks.
Yeah.
They came out with their podcast. So Ray Youssef has a podcast. There's so many Bitcoin podcasts. The Jack Mallers says his podcast is not a Bitcoin podcast. It's Money Matters, and it's about money and all sorts of other stuff.
Oh, so it's a Robert Breedlove podcast.
Well, I would say more like Kaiser Report. So Kaiser Report was the first, and we didn't do just Bitcoin, but we covered a lot of Bitcoin, but we covered macroeconomics. We were the first to do that in a very unique way, in a very heterodox way.
Jack Mallers is our child.
He is. Like he did say, we know him well, so he's grown up on Kaiser Report. So
he was watching Kaiser Report when he was just going through puberty.
Maybe, but so he's now got a podcast, and he did a 3-hour interview with
the two Jacks.
Jack Dorsey. But it's like 2.5 hours. That's too long for me to watch. But we used to do that with the Orange Pill podcast. We would do 2-hour-long live streams, though, because live stream it feels different, right? Like because you're talking to the audience and you're reading the feedback, and so that can make sense as 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
But and it's weird because men in real life.
Men, yes.
Like
I can talk on that subject.
If I'm at dinner with a bunch of women and a bunch of men, the men don't talk, right?
They don't.
But women
make fun of women for talking too much.
Yeah, but then they go on a podcast and suddenly they just talk for hours.
Why do they become women once they become on a podcast?
Exactly.
The two Jacks are the two Jills. They should have said the two Jills are on a podcast with Jill Mallers and Jill Dorsey. Are going to talk for 3 hours about nonsense. They talk about the JFK assassination in 1963. Yeah. I mean, okay, it's great that this new generation are talking about stuff that happened 50, 60 years ago. I lived through it. I was 3 years old at the assassination.
No 3-year-old lives through anything.
And I was brilliantly encapsulating the impact culturally on America on my Twitter feed at Max Kaiser Twitter.
Okay, but the thing that struck me about that is two things. In the last few minutes here, I want to say twofold. A federal judge on July 4th, our Independence Day, told the Biden administration that they can they're not allowed, the FBI, no federal agency is allowed to contact any social media or Twitter to stop American voices. They're not allowed to suppress free speech. Okay. So they've been told that. That was remarkable, right? It got overlooked, of course, because it was a federal, a big holiday in America, so people missed that. But the other thing is... I
was so happy I went outside and burned an American flag.
So, but the other thing that happened was that Jack, I think the fact that Jack said that, he said, yes, I believe the CIA assassinated JFK, which is remarkable because he obviously he ran Twitter, he was a CEO, and he owns still a big chunk of it. Like, he knows the consequences for any conspiracy theory. You get shut down, right? And you get deplatformed and silenced. So that he was willing to say that is just a remarkable sort of event that he would say that. I mean, you and I met RFK Jr. a few years ago on Kaiser Report, like 6 or 7 years ago in London, and he said, like, the CIA had killed his uncle, like he believed that. So we already knew that, but now it's like openly being discussed. It's quite interesting. That's a total change from anything.
It's a litmus test for freedom of speech.
Yeah.
If you can openly discuss the JFK CIA assassination of 1963, and of course his brother, his father, RFK, and of course let's not forget Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Right? These were all political assassinations, and they have the CIA's thumbprints all over them. And
FBI, COINTELPRO,
and now that this is being openly discussed again, it's a real sea change from what we went through recently when there was absolutely draconian censorship on social media and free speech completely shut down. Kudos to those people who pushed through that wall of censorship, like, for example, the comedian who I used to do a great impression of.
Louis C.K., Richard Lewis, like Max. No, but also I wanted to say, like, one thing, the hysteria. So usually when there's hysteria, it's a diversion, and that convinces you to live in so much fear that you agree to surveillance states, or you agree to the suppression of your civil liberties. And we had watched, like in the past 2 or 3 years, this documentary about the Weather Underground. And I think it might have been a Ken Burns thing, but basically it showed the 60s and 70s in America. So when you tune in to Rachel Maddow crying on MSNBC and all these FBI agents who, like, they were like, here's our MSNBC presenter, he's also an FBI agent, and you're like, wait, isn't that freaking weird? Apparently not, but nevertheless, they were on the news, like, saying how this is the most dangerous time in U.S. history, like during the Trump years. And then you look at what happened in the 60s, and you're like, oh my God, like, it was crazier than France.
Yeah,
right?
the Weather Underground blew up something more than 20 or a score.
No, because I remember watching it with you, and it mentioned that there were 2,000 bombs that went off in just New York City alone, and you were like right there, right outside. 2,000 in New York City in federal offices.
Right, so that was clearly domestic terrorism.
Yeah.
And the Weather Underground was a very active group, during the anti-war movement. I mean, this is when the aftermath of the JFK assassination of 1963 was it energized groups like the Weather Underground, the Black Panthers, the women's movement, the gay rights movement, all these various groups and movements were really urgently brought to the fore, and this defined that decade, and before, I would say, the advent of disco, and then we had a new era.
Well, these were the boomers when they were teenagers, and the boomers when they were teenagers were pretty woke. They were pretty, interesting. Yeah. Now they're like freaking fascists on MSNBC. They're like Hillary Clinton.
Pure fascism.
Yeah, they're pure fascists. And it's like,
pure.
Dudes, like, what happened to what you were when you were a teenager in young 20s? You used to be pretty cool. Blowing up federal buildings, now you're like locking people up in federal buildings. Like, shut the, anyway.
I mean, it used to be, the t-shirt was question authority, and then it became don't question authority.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? Can you feel me?
That's what I'm saying. All these cycles, the hard men create good times.
Yeah.
Good times create hard time. Good.
Yeah,
something
I know
like that.
exactly.
It's called something.
Ask not what your country, it's what your pina colada is worth on the beach. The guy I'm trying to think of, I thought of, Dave Chappelle. That's the comedian who kept free speech alive during the dark days of censorship. Dave Chappelle, a big shout out for keeping it real. We're on the other side, possibly, of this censorship quagmire. Well, speaking of censorship, I guess it's time to say goodbye.
It's time to censor you and exit the show.
Bye, y'all.